Okay, so we've got the basic idea of MVC. And we've also seen how that can be standardized and how Java actually embraces it. Okay, it was derived in the context of Smalltalk. But this observable interfaces came very early in Java, I think in the very first version of Java. And we're going to try to scale this idea up. Okay, so I started with the smallest example I could dream of, a counter, which is just one value. And the question becomes, what happens when we come up with bigger objects? Maybe something with multiple properties in it. And then we want to go next to something even bigger, which is a composite object, which has got other objects in it, each of which is potentially observable. And how do we go and observe those? And what should really be happening in those objects? Okay? And that is not a totally artificial problem for you guys. You guys have your scene, which is composite object, and we've got this refresh method that we want to get rid of. So let's go and see how we could avoid that. So tell me now with, a little bit more complex object, a BMI spreadsheet, not a counter, not just one value, but multiple values. And how would this class change to make it an observable BMI spreadsheet? And let's just talk conceptually first, then we can get down to the exact methods that we need. So let's go and remember our theory that in the case of counter, whenever the add method was called, it notified its observers. And it said, I've changed, and this is my new value. Okay? And I told you earlier that we generalized model view controller, and the model view controller is more general. We generalize the counter to model view controller by saying, whenever a write method is called, it should go and notify its observers. Okay? And in general, you must also have an add, some kind of method that adds observers. It could be called add observer or something else. Okay? And it'll be nice to also have remove observer, but let's at least have add observer. Okay? So I could, of course, if I was to just use the observer pattern that I described earlier. Okay? Just use the java.util.observable and observer pattern. What would I do? I would make my BMI spreadsheet a subclass of observable. Okay, then I would get the add observer method automatically. And whenever I did set weight or set height, I would say notify all observers. And I would go and maybe pass some value. Who knows what value I should pass? So that's how I would do it if I was to use what we've learned earlier. Okay? We learned earlier something that worked very well for counters. This generic interface that has an update method that takes as an argument who changed and what the change was. And I could just go and make BMI spreadsheet a subclass of observable and don't have to go and add any registration method. And in my set weight and my set height, I would just go and say update myself. And then what should I do? What should the second argument of update be? Let's try to answer that question. I could go and say, update, and I've changed. In which case, object editor could, or any other view could go and just read all the values and say, okay, I'm going to display all of them. Or I could pass in the second argument something. Yeah.
You could pass what changed.
In the second argument?
Yeah.
So how would I describe what changed? In the counter case, I just passed my value. And I've deliberately gone to something with more than one property in it to complicate matters. So what would be a way to describe what changed?
You could describe, height and weight, and then have it so if it's past height, it calls get height and uses that value, and if it's past weight, it calls it weight.
Okay, so the intention is that when I go and call set weight, I say weight equals new weight, and then I call some update method, which indicates the weight changed, and here's the new value of the weight. Okay? So that is what we need now. And an update method takes an object as an argument. I could somehow code in the object. I could have a little field in that object. I could have a special kind of object that has its one field, the name of the property, and another field, the value. But if I did that, object editor wouldn't know how to decompose the object because that object is defined by me. So I would need some standard interface to describe which property changed and what the value is. Okay? So my observer class, observer interface, an observable class that I got from Java does not work very well here. Okay? You can go and just say update, and in which case object editor doesn't know what to do with the second argument, and so it can just call all the getters. Yeah.
In the notifying method, you can add a parameter that adds like a string or something to identify the property that changed. So the observer only changes that one newly changed property.
Okay, so you're coming to the next step, that rather than saying update object observable some object, my update method takes now 3 arguments, at least. Who changed? Which property changed, the string, and what the change to that property was. So I need something more sophisticated and different. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And if we did that, by the way, we won't have to do this refresh, like I said earlier. We will just call set weight, set height. We don't have to pass the OE frame as an argument. You know, that was all messy stuff. And that's why I made it all extra credit. And I would go and just, so how do we apply MVC to this? Basic idea is that we want, again, the right methods to notify. And we just need to decide now a standard way of doing the notification and registration. We need a different standard. That's my point. Okay? And how do we adapt this? I'm just, we must use, again, general scheme. And we go and, I have too many slides here. Okay. We finally get to the meat of the thing. So, what I'm going to do is pass a particular kind of object, and that object is going to have the description. So I'm not going to pass, the string name and the value directly. I'm going to construct an argument called a property change event, and this is not my invention. This comes from the Beam people. Okay, so I'm going to notify all listeners. Okay, and I'm going to notify to all listeners an object that describes what happened. Okay? So rather than having 4 arguments that are in one method, I'm going to take those 4 arguments or 5 arguments, however many we have here, put them all into one object, and send that object across to my observer. Okay? And that is a property change event. So what you're doing is informing somebody about an event, and you're not just sending an object, but that event is something that you can further decompose into components, and you're saying, I changed. So I go and say the source. Which property changed? I give the property name. I give the new value of the property. And I also give it the old value. Okay? Just in case the view goes and can make use of that. Okay? So there might be some value that is being displayed in a very coarse-grained way by one view and in a very fine-grained way by another view. Somebody may be displaying things to months. Somebody may be displaying things to days. So the coarse-grained one says, yeah, these 2 values are so close that I'm not going to even bother to update. Yeah.
I was going to ask, do you really need to include the new weight parameter when there's a readable map? When weight is a gettable property? Then I remember
Okay, so the question is, should I go and pass the weight along when object editor or the view could go and do get weight? Okay? And going back to the China USA example,
it's not efficient.
It's not efficient. So why not just go and have it use that value? Okay? Now you could cheat and give it a wrong value and you could just confuse the view. But that's the goal. Okay? So now I've complicated matters a little bit because I don't want to write my registrations code again and again for each Bean class. Okay? And I don't want to inherit from some class because I might want to inherit from a shape class other than from some observer class. Okay? So I have this property listener support, which is an object I can instantiate, and that will deal with the registration, notification, and other tasks. Okay? And this is again based on what Java has. It's not exactly what Java has because I just want to show you how this is implemented. So I've done my own class, and also if you're doing debugging, you want to go into the source code and actually see what's happening. So if you go and copy this class over to your project, then you can go and debug through it. If you use classes that other people have provided, sometimes you have source code, sometimes you don't have source code, and you can't debug in it. Okay? So that's why I've gone and created my own property listener support. And whenever and I've got, rather than add observer, I've got property change listener. Okay? Observer, listener as synonyms. Okay? And that takes property listener as an argument, change listener. And all I do is say, I don't want to keep track of adding things to the list, so I just say property listener support, add element listener. Okay? So that will go and keep track of everything and take all the observers. And my set weight, I go and remember what the old weight was, and I make sure I'm very defensive that my property listener support is not null. Only then I do this. And I go and say notify all listeners, and I go and say not only did the weight change, but the BMI changed also. And that was and you could have, and I go and just pass these values to that particular.
Why are you passing like the old weight and old BMI?
So old weight and old BMI, I kind of give a reason. Anybody want to say it in your words? Why am I passing the old value? What is the reason I gave? Just in case they're interested. And why might they be interested? Some practical example? How much has changed? So I'm showing something to various degrees of granularity. If the stock price changed by a little bit, somebody showing to that degree would change the view. Somebody else would say, you know what, I'm not going to bother refreshing the screen. That's a very expensive operation, actually, refreshing the screen. So you might do that. And in fact, if you use Java's property support, if the two values are same, it doesn't even bother to inform the observers. Okay, so if you accidentally go and notify, it says, okay, I'm not going to bother. Okay, so that is what you do. But as it turns out, Object Editor pretty much ignores that value. Okay, so you can always pass null there. I don't encourage you to do that, but if you don't want to keep track of this code, and you can just pass null, in which case it'll still display the new value. Okay, questions? Okay, so you can, this is the most important thing for your next assignment. And the concepts you learned in the previous slide deck, this is just telling you some API issues. Okay? So this is a standard event and standard registration support. Okay? And this is a standard bean listener signature. So we are just using standards here. And okay, now here's an interesting thing. I made this observable BMI spreadsheet implement the property listener registrar interface. Okay, this is an interface. This is something that Object Editor has. This is not part of standard Bean support. Okay, Bean says that as long as you have an add property list change listener method, some other object will discover this method and call it. If you don't have it, it won't call it. So if you make a little mistake and not call it, for instance, you say add property listener rather than add property change listener, the Bean tools won't find your method. And that kind of mistake is easy to make. Okay, we've seen this kind of mistake can be made also with your getters and setters. And to avoid that problem, we introduced annotations. Okay, and you can put a little annotation here saying, look, this is a property listener, and if your method does not follow the signature expected of a property listener, it will go and Object Editor will complain. So that's one way to catch the mistake. Okay, and what I would recommend, and which is something I put more recently, is that you always make your classes that are property change announcers implement this particular interface. This interface has this particular method in it. And if you say I implement this interface and you don't have this method, Java will complain. Not Object Editor, but Java will complain, and that's better. Okay? So you can use either of these two techniques. You don't have to use both. I strongly recommend, and maybe I'll require that in the assignment, that you actually implement this particular interface. And this is part of Object Editor, and it is so you'll have to, and you just name this interface, and Eclipse will find it. Okay. So that's your property listener registrar, and it has this is the method that it requires you to implement. Okay. And let's quickly go and see what the registration support is. And the reason why you have this registration support is because you don't want to subclass of some class. And, in Java, you can only subclass from one class, and we don't want it to be some observable class. And it's not complicated. I'm doing it using arrays here, but we could have done it using array lists. Like I said, this is stuff I actually teach at a lower level also. And all it does is it's a history. Okay. I guess it doesn't have a remove method in that case. And it's a history that can notify. Okay. So it keeps track of all the elements that have been added. Plus, when you say notify all listeners, it goes through all the history. It expects each element in the history to be some observable that is a property change listener, and it goes and informs each element about the method. Okay, so this is nothing complicated here. Once you know collections, this is an application of collections, and you guys can just go and use this particular class directly. And I'm presenting it here only so that you know what you're using. Okay, yeah.
So this implementation interface will obviate the need to inherit from Observable?
No, you don't have to inherit from java.util.observable. Okay, because that's a different interface. It's not going to work for us. It doesn't work for, it's not a good interface for us for two reasons, a class for us for two reasons. First, it doesn't support property changes. Second, it requires us to inherit. So two wrongs there. And we're going to fix both of them. And that's what Java did. It fixed both of them through this property change stuff. And that came later, much later, after observable. Question? Okay. So there is a class called property change support. And if you want to, you can use that class directly. You may have source code for it. And if you don't, it's nice to step through and say, okay, this particular, it's nice to go and step through this loop sometimes, I've found. Okay. So I have a property change registrar, that is my interface. And these are the interfaces that Java provides. Property change listener, which has a property change method in it that takes a property change event. Okay. So this is the event you construct. The property change event is a class, and these are the constructor arguments which we saw being used earlier. The source, the property name, the old value, and the new value. And there's a lot of interesting methods in there that you as the announcer are not concerned with, but you as the observer are concerned with. Okay, so you need to get the new value, get the old value, get the property name. So in your next assignment, I'm going to ask you guys to announce changes and listen to changes. Okay? So I'm going to ask you to create one big observer that listens to every atomic shape in your scene. And I'll require you guys to announce changes to all the atomic shapes. And so you'll get a log of all the things that have happened in this view. Okay? So that's going to be the goal. So you need to know both about how to announce events and how to go and receive events and look at their components. So this is where you'll see use the get new value and get old value and get property name methods. Okay? Questions? Okay, so this is just some stuff. This is just putting things together. My model now has an add property change listener method in it rather than an add observer method. It still has write methods. And my view now has a property change method in it rather than an update method. Okay, so we've just changed the name of the update method to property change method. Okay, and we have read methods in the model. And this is just saying in text what I've already said. So this is just for you guys to use later when you're quickly going through the PDFs. And now if you do all of this stuff, you don't have to go and say refresh. That's the best news. Okay. And also, you don't get any error message saying you've done something wrong. Okay, no warnings now. So from now onwards, okay, we don't want any warnings. Okay, there's a reason why I put that warning, just to make sure that later you'll remove them and we'll know that you removed them. Okay, so we've scaled from
Sorry, why don't we need a refresh?
So what was the reason for the refresh? From the main method, you were going and changing the model, and you wanted to tell object editor, please go and update the value. Now the model is doing what when you go and change it? it goes and announces to everybody that I've changed. An object editor, if you are implementing this, become an observable, okay, if you implement the property change registrar interface, it goes and calls the add observer method, add property change listener method in it, and registers itself, so it gets the notifications. So it goes, looks at your object and says, are you an observable or not? If you're not observable, I'll do one thing. And if you're observable, I'll do another thing. And that another thing is that I'll go and add myself as a listener or observer to you. So since your write methods are announcing that, your main doesn't have to announce it. When those of you guys did the extra, those of you guys who did the extra credit last time know that in your write methods you were calling refresh. Okay? In your move methods. And now rather than calling refresh in your move methods, you'll be just saying announce property change, whoever's interested. So you're not in any way coupled with object edit. You're just coupled with the notion of a property change listener. Okay? You're not tied to these concepts. Questions? Okay, let's now scale up. Okay, so from counter, we went to an object with multiple properties. Now let's go to an object with multiple objects in it. Okay? And we've got an object, a Cartesian plane was my example. Okay, was my simplest example, which had an x-axis, x-label, y-axis, y-label, and also had an axis length as an integer value. Okay? And now what I want to happen is that I go and say object editor.edit Cartesian plane. Okay? And then I want to say Cartesian plane dot set axis length to 100. I want the axes to all change in both dimensions without calling refresh an object editor. Okay, that's my goal. And how do I make that work? Okay, so my goal now is for this composite object to be refreshed without my calling refresh, without the main program going and calling the refresh method, object editor.refresh method. So object editor refresh method is something that's banned now. In fact, that's something that I just added last year. I didn't even want people to use it, but I realized that if I gave refresh method to you earlier, you could go and do some early things, some things that are earlier, like animations. Otherwise, too many things happened in the later half of the course. Okay? So, you guys understand the problem? We'll try to find the answer. So my set axis length is this method. This is my write method. Clearly something must happen in the write method. Okay? If we are going to go and automatically display the object. So my axis length changed. So I can certainly go and say property change support, notify all listeners. I can create an event in which I go and say my property axis length changed. This was the old value, this was the new value. I can certainly do that. That will be following exactly what we did in the BMI spreadsheet. Whenever a property changed, you go and say, this property changed. Okay? But in the BMI spreadsheet case, we didn't just go and say, when weight was changed, we didn't just say the weight was changed. We also said BMI got changed. So when a when a write method is called, we have to announce not only changes to the property being changed, but also the dependent properties being changed. Okay? So so I go and announce the change to axis length. What other changes do I need to announce now? What other notifications do I need to send? Austin? So I should somehow say x-axis, I should pass x-axis as an object and say its width property change. Here was its old value, here was its new value. Do that for the height. So I have to go and fire all of these things, right? Maybe refresh was better. And we can do that. And the one problem with that is that wherever if I create another object with lines, that object must also do the same thing. Right? So this kind of code is pain to write in the first place. And second place, all composite, if I take some atomic objects, compose them into one object and another object. Both of these objects must go and announce changes on behalf of these atomic objects. Even though they're sharing the same classes, they have to go and announce changes. So can we do something better that is more modular, that doesn't require the composer to announce changes? And if it doesn't require the composer to announce changes, what must be happening? I'm calling a set width method in x-axis, right? That's a write method. That write method could also announce, perhaps. So rather than my composite object announcing on behalf of the atomic object or the component object has a set method. It can do the announcement. Okay? For that to work, my view must go through the whole object structure and register itself as a view of not only the top level object, but each object in the tree that it creates. Okay, so each basically changeable object, each observable object, you have to make yourself observer of. Zach?
Isn't that much more inefficient though, because then you're calling refresh 10 times?
Okay, so that's a good point. That rather than getting one event in object editor, you get, regardless of who does the announcement, regardless of whether it is my set axis length that does the announcement or my set width, set height methods in here that do the announcement, object editor is getting many, many different announcements. Okay? Now each announcement is saying this property changed. So yes, it will get many announcements, but each announcement will change only one value. So depending on how the UI is, if the UI is constructed of multiple modules inside it, it says this text field changes, this text field changes, this text field changes, and in the case of your refresh, it goes and, it has to do that. If it's not smart, it'll change all the text fields each time. But if you're doing graphics, which we'll do later, where anyway it's not decomposed into multiple components, it does become more inefficient. Yes. In fact, you'll see that things won't animate that smoothly. Maybe things animated more smoothly with your refresh than without the refresh. Okay, that is a trade-off. Okay, but you guys get the basic idea. I think I'm going to show that. So you need to notify the axis length, and this is something to really remember, that notification is only for the atomic properties. As long as the atomic guys go and change, we don't have to go and say that, because you see my y-axis object didn't change. I don't have to go and say my y-axis changed, my x-axis changed, because the object is the same, its component changed. It's like you bought a car, and when you painted the tire of the car didn't change. Yes, some part of the car changed. The paint of the tire changed, but the tire didn't change, and the car didn't change. So you don't go and say, look, I have a new car, or I have a new tire. The tire just announces and says, I have a new paint. Okay? So that's basically what's going on. So you don't, unless your composite object changes, unless you really put a new tire in, you don't go and say the tire changed. Okay? And many students do that. An object editor will just assume you have a new tire and recreate the view, and that's more inefficient. So unless you assign new objects to the components, you don't go and send notifications for composites, and new objects should be assigned only if necessary. Okay, I told you that, guys, that you shouldn't be creating new objects. You should be just changing atomic objects. Okay, so this is my set axis method now. Now my x-axes are not my regular lines; they are observable lines, and so they are richer classes, and these announce things. And because these announce events, all I do in my set axis length is say, notify all listeners about the axis length change, and I don't have to go and notify about other things. Okay? So this is showing in code what I said earlier. This is not showing you the complete set axis length. Oh, I guess it is showing you. I'm using inheritance right now. So it's saying, do whatever my old set axis length did, and then go and notify all listeners about my axis length having changed. This is the only atomic property in me, so this is the only value I will go and change. Otherwise, my children will make the change. Okay? Questions? Peter?
Say the axis length was a property of a part, and you changed it as so.
Hang on. Axis length was a property of a car.
Oh, I'm not sure how to bring it out.
What if axis length was a property of another object?
Yeah. And so.
And you went and that particular object changed. So then that object will have to become observable and announce changes to axis length.
And that second object would reflect the change in axis length.
Because object editor, what does object editor do? It displays all the, when it displays a composite object, it goes through the whole tree and ultimately displays all the atomic objects, right? That's what it's really doing. So as long as the atomic objects are the ones that make the announcements, all of them the display will get refreshed completely. Okay? Because the display of a composite object is the sum of the displays of the component objects. Okay? But in this case, the composite object has some property that that it's storing and no other object is storing, so it has to make an announcement. Okay? Questions? So no notifications for composite properties elements unless new objects assigned to them. I'm just repeating this. Atomic objects now announce events. Okay, so where I had a set X, which now I'll have in a string shape. Now I have a set X in an observable string shape. And I'm inheriting here. Sometimes I'm inheriting, sometimes I'm not. A little non-uniform here. And I go and say property support, notify all listeners, this X old val new val. Okay? So basically all your atomic classes with your setters and setters must change, must be changed. But if you use inheritance properly, okay, a set X method is not repeated in more than one class. A set Y method is not repeated in more than one class. A set width and set height methods also not repeated. So because of inheritance, you'll be able to change only 4 methods and get it all working. Okay? Questions? Okay, this is what this text is saying. Okay, so basically what object editor does, to make this clear, is that when you ask it to go and display an object structure, let's just call the view object in object editor OE view. OE view will go, and there'll be a view registered with the top level object. There's another view registered with its children, and so forth. So the whole logical tree will have a view object observing it. Okay, so there's lots of view objects around, which together form one big view object. And object editor will make sure that all of these things are bound to your component objects. So notification from any component in your logical tree will be listened to. Okay, that's the basic point. It's not that it just registers with the top level object. If it did that, then the top level object would have to make all the announcements. Okay? And basically registers by calling the add property change listener. So you can, in fact, in your add property change listener method, in the class that I gave you, you can put a little breakpoint to see when it's being called. And you'll go and see that, oh, it's being called now and it's not being called now. And this is just some text. Okay, now let's go and see some wrong ways of doing things, okay, which will work, but which are not right, okay. Rather than doing what I said earlier, I could have done this. I could have made the announcement in the set axes method and said notify all listeners and said my axis length changed and my x-axis changed, my y-axis changed, my x label changed, my y label changed, and they haven't really changed. But I'm basically doing this to tell object editor that please go and update me. That I'm trying to use this method to invocation to tell object editor to go and redisplay that object. That's what I'm trying to do. And many of you will do this. I never tell people about this, but people end up doing this anyway. And object editor does react to this and will display things correctly. But please don't do this, because this is like saying, like I said earlier, that my tire got painted and I say my tire changed. Okay? An object editor will redisplay the whole tire. It'll be very inefficient. It'll work, but it's not a good thing to do. Okay? So this is an alternative way to do things, and I don't want you guys to use this. Okay? So it'll redraw the whole object. So it's inefficient, but will work. And it's not even correct, because my x-axis hasn't changed. It's the same object. Okay, now here's a subtle point. If my object announces events, then things work very efficiently, and object editor will display it. If my object does not announce events, and I call some setter method through object editor will go and refresh the whole object on each setter, right? So when I said set height, object editor went and refreshed the complete state, because I didn't announce any event. When I announce events, object editor says, this is a very sophisticated object, so I'll just go and react to its events. Okay? The question becomes, what if I announce some events and don't announce other events? So what if I go and forget to announce 3 events, announce 2 events? Okay, and this is probably not the best example. In the BMI spreadsheet, what if I announce change to weight but not to BMI? What do you think object editor will do? If I don't announce either of the change, whenever I go and do set weight, it will go and update everything. Now if I, in set weight or in this particular method, I announce change to weight but not to BMI, what bad thing might happen?
Will it just update what you announce and ignore the rest?
It'll says you're sophisticated, you know what you're doing. Okay? So you'll lose the change to BMI. Austin, yeah, same thing. And when I said this last time in class, somebody said, oh, this is like if I don't define a constructor, a default constructor is put in. But if I define a constructor, I don't get a default constructor. I have to explicitly put the default constructor. Okay, so when I start being sophisticated, I sometimes need to do more work. Okay, I'll lose the default thing. So just remember this, that some things may change, some may not change, and that's because you're not making enough announcements. Okay, so things that were working smoothly may not work smoothly now. Okay. Okay, so this is a partially observable object, and just make sure that your object is fully observable, otherwise it won't get changed. Okay, now some of you are going to find this a bit of an issue, the next assignment. Many of you are not, or some of you at least I know from Piazza, and I told you guys that this is an alternative way of implementing things. When your composite object changes, you do not go and call setters and component objects to update their values. Okay? So when somebody says move avatar, you don't go and change the X methods in each line in the avatar. You don't change the X property in each component of the avatar. What are some of you doing? Your get method in the components have a reference to the avatar, and they're computing their X value based on the point in the top level object. Can you guys see that? So basically you will, in the case of Cartesian plane, you just set the axis length to something, and you expect all the lines underneath you to automatically go and return the correct values based on this axis length, because they have this particular object in your constructor. So can you guys see what can go wrong now? How many of you are using this scheme to implement? I saw in Piazza's. In fact, I remember this. Scotty Mark, is he here? Aren't you using this? Or you're not paying attention?
I'm using it.
Okay, you're using it. You're using it too.
I'm not.
Oh, good. Because you're not, you're going to be, I'm not saying good. I'm saying that that's actually a very nice way of doing things. Okay, those of you who did it, you were good. Okay? But now you're going to have a problem. Okay, so if you're not paying attention, you should be paying attention. Okay? So for those of you who are paying attention and understand the problem, what's going to go wrong?
When do you notify?
you've got getter methods. If they're called to return the right value, object editor is not going to call them because you did not say that property changed. So you guys would have to go and announce in each of these objects, you'll have to go and say, this property changed, this property changed, this property changed, and you'll have to do something like this. You'll have to say, notify all listeners, my X label changed, here is its X value, and here's the old label X, and here's the new label X, and so forth. Okay, so since you don't have setters essentially in your component objects, somebody else will have to do the announcement for you. And that's okay. I mean, if that's how you program, you have some benefits, you have some very clean programming, but you have some unclean programming. That's sort of a trade-off you make. Okay? Yeah.
So for all of the shape classes that we have, we need to have a notifier in all of the atomic properties.
Yes, but your atomic properties are only in one superclass, hopefully.
Okay.
The set X, set Y, set width, set height are there only once, hopefully. Yeah, otherwise you have to repeat them. Okay, we'll see you on the exam. Please come early to the exam, as I say in the announcement. We'll take a while to distribute the exams. Yeah. Okay, so and this is an issue that you're going to face. You're going to say, look, I did all this work and object editor is not updated. And, is there a bug? And yes, it can be a bug. But please don't send me mail till you've done some kind of check system. So what kind of checks should you do? Now, this is different from the automatic refresh. I told you what to do with automatic refresh. Go and try the refresh button. You create a new view. But now your notifications are not being heard. If your notifications are not being heard, apparently, what all could have gone wrong besides object editor being not functioning?
Might not be calling to notify all of the
You may not be notifying. Okay. What else could have gone wrong? Because listener method. And you might have that method, you look at it and say it's all right, but you spelled it wrong, you got the right, So how to verify that that's happening or not? Put a breakpoint, put some print line saying that's got that. Please object editor knows about you. Then you have to see whether you're notifying. So let's see. So you might not have a registration method. If you're writing all observer, then the observer is not calling that method, but hopefully that's not a problem with object editor. You're not doing a notification, and the observer may not be reacting correctly. So that's again an OE bug.